Hello and welcome to the Sunday Guardian show by Joyeeta Basu. I'm Joyeeta Basu, editor of the weekly newspaper published from New Delhi. Today on my show, I have a very special guest, Ms. Cleo Paskal, who is non-resident senior fellow for Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She's also a Canadian and she's also a huge friend of mine, by the way. Because she's Canadian, we are going to discuss a little bit of Justin Trudeau. Welcome to the show, Cleo. And first, I'm going to ask you about what is up with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. He has just accused, in very vague terms, saying that, there's an allegation of a potential connection with the Indian government of murdering an Canadian citizen. By the way, this Canadian citizen, what Mr. Trudeau did not tell his parliament was that this so-called Canadian citizen is actually, there are some doubts about whether he is actually a Canadian citizen or not, because he tried to get citizenship under a fake name. It was rejected. Then he got married to somebody, and that person tried to get him a citizenship. That was rejected, and I think he was kind of, the whole lot of problems are there. So that part is a little unclear about whether this man is a Canadian citizen or not. And apart from the fact that he is actually a terrorist, Indian government, India calls that person a terrorist. There's an Interpol red corner notice against him. So you see, and he is charged of serious crimes, and he has been throughout associating with people who have been involved with that bombing of the Air India bombing that took place. Why is it that suddenly Mr. Trudeau would feel the need to name and literally shame India in front of the parliament, and basically try to, what in our opinion, what he's trying to do is that he is trying to stoke emotions by finding an enemy in India? What exactly is going to gain by this?
It's those are all good questions, and there are a lot of different ways of getting at this, and it's so unprecedented and odd that it takes a while to kind of break it down into its component pieces. And I think that, you're very right to begin by saying, allegations of potential whatever, like there's no, in this case, literal smoking gun that's being presented. And if you're going to blow up a relationship with key democracy, then it would be good if you could present incontrovertible proof. And the normal way, I think, of doing it would be you get your case together and then you brief your allies on it, so that your allies all know what's about to happen, and understand why you're doing it, because it's beyond the case of just this case. It has huge geopolitical consequences. And then as a united front, you discuss it. Often, I would imagine, not even publicly, you would discuss it with that other country and try to get it resolved without derailing everything else. So what this looks like is regardless of the case, it's a political act. It's not an act of justice. This isn't a legal case. This isn't an investigation. This isn't, this was political. That's why he did it on the floor of the House of Parliament. And what it does is it completely changes the narrative of Trudeau's relationship with India. So before this happened, within Canada and globally, Trudeau was known to have a bad. People still remember when he dressed up in costume and tried to make India a backdrop to his own Bollywood movie. And he, that itself gave people reminders of when he dressed up in blackface multiple times, in his own past. And this is a relationship that should be incredibly important to Canada, in part because of India's pivotal relationship in the Indo-Pacific, and we have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Quad is important for the whole region, all that sort of stuff. So before this, 48 hours ago, Trudeau looked like an incompetent actor on the world stage who was damaging a relationship with a key Democratic ally. Now Trudeau can paint himself as somebody who's standing up to a fascistic, terrorist supporting, murderous state, right? So he's grabbed control of again, regardless of whatever the case is, if you take just a look at the political narrative of the relationship of Trudeau and India, it's changed 48 degrees. And people who we know who 48 hours ago were perfectly willing to criticize Trudeau in the context of things like Chinese political interference, because this is happening almost exactly in the same few days as Canada is about to finally launch an inquiry into Chinese political influence in Canada, including manipulation of the elections. And the government has been at great pains to say, this isn't just about Chinese political influence. This is about the Iranians and the Russians and the Indians. So now they can also play down the Chinese component, which we had a Canadian member of parliament testify before the Congressional Executive Commission on China in Washington just a few days ago about how he was targeted in Chinese political influence operations. That also gets wiped off the front page. And the third element is, if you remember the trucker protest in Canada, they're currently putting the two leaders on trial in Canada, and it's really not being reported. But the case, they're being tried for things like mischief. This is Tamara Litch and Chris Barber. And yesterday at the trial, the prosecution, so the government, tried to introduce as a witness a police officer from Quebec who arrived in Ottawa the day after they were arrested. He had none of his own notes in the case. He didn't speak English. And the judge was like, why are you presenting somebody who wasn't even there when they were not in jail? Like the case does not look good. So Trudeau is, he's grabbed control of the narrative. And given the way that it was done, and again, facts of the case aside, it looks like it's a political move and not about getting to the bottom of the murder of a terrorist in Canada. We don't, this happened in June. Why isn't the investigation further ahead? Why did he do it when he came back after the G20? Why doesn't he have better evidence to show if he's going to blow up that relationship? It just, as a Canadian, but more importantly, as somebody who cares about transparency, accountability, rule of law, the whole process, the timing, the way it was done makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah. So what would you say when you're talking about Chinese influence operation in Canada? How serious is it?
Oh, it's totally serious. I mean, they're running the same extraterritorial police stations that they use for the intimidation of the Chinese population that they've done elsewhere. They're doing in Canada. There's funding of specific candidates, alleged funding of specific candidates. There's attacks on others. I mean, it's Canada has had a strain within it that has been deeply penetrated for decades. Canada was one of the first countries to de-recognize Taiwan or ROC and recognize PRC. And that was in 1970. We did it before the Americans did it. And it was under Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who went to China, communist China, in 1949. He went again, and I think around 1960. He was a big advocate for this normalization of relations. He pioneered Canada pioneered the language around the One China policy, where, you know, we acknowledge that China says that Taiwan belongs to China, but we don't say it does, but we acknowledge we helped to create that language that was then used by the U.S. and others to by Nixon and others to create those relationships. So we have been kind of integrated into the way China interacts with the Western world since 1970. And in the 70s, they set up the Canada-China Business Council, which has as members companies you may have heard of, like SNC-Lavalin, famous in southern India for dubious reasons, Bombardier, Power Corp. Power Corp is a big money company. And 4 Canadian prime ministers, including Pierre Trudeau, have worked for Power Corp. And Power Corp is one of the has run a lot of money in and out of China. So the penetration by China into the Canadian political elite is 5 decades old. These are generational relationships, and our current prime minister visited Tiananmen Square not long after the tanks rolled through with his father and his brother on a family vacation. So I don't know what to tell you. I mean,
that's a huge story. I mean, there's a story in itself.
But who, you know, report it.
The right mind will do something like that. I mean, let's if we are talking, I might as well be, you know, I mean, talk about it. I mean, who in their right mind, think of the optics, you know, where this violence took place, to go there on a vacation and normalizing the whole thing. I mean, what can be worse than that? Now here
there's a photo online. You can Google it. There's a photo online of them standing in Tiananmen Square. And you know, Justin was young at the time, but you know, this motivation within Canada for this flirtation with those sorts of regimes, including Cuba, for example, you know, comes from a multiple strands. One is a knee-jerk anti-American imperialism. Another is which translates into a kind of left-wing ideology that is easily manipulated by outside forces. In the case of China, there were children of Canadian missionaries that became very who had been in China, who somehow bought into this communist. You'd think if they were missionaries, they wouldn't buy into the communist thing, but they bought into this communist vision of China, came back, and because they spoke Mandarin, got into the Canadian civil service and helped to shape Canadian foreign policy as it regards China. Several of the first Canadian ambassadors to China were missionary kids of these initial missionaries, you know. And then there's the money people who made a lot of money off of China. So the strands go out quite deep. And as you know very well, the Khalistani movement or terrorist organization has strong linkages to ISI, which itself has strong linkages to the Chinese. So, you know, it's not.
Here I have a question. The minute we are now, because you see the China angle, when we are talking about it, this kind of I mean, how much of this could have possibly been influenced by China? I mean, for Mr. Trudeau to come out and say something like this, and not just that, it seems to me, given the fact Mr. Trudeau's people have gone and told certain, he apparently told Mr. Biden, Mr. Sunak, and the Australians, all of them, when they were in this thing, that India has done it. Apparently, he sent somebody to the UK to say the relations between India and Canada are going to blow up. So it almost seems it is designed to paint India into a corner, basically what happened with the MBS case, remember, Mohammed bin Salman and the murder of that Jamal Khashoggi, because of which there was a huge uproar in the Western world. And as a result of which, MBS kind of Mohammed bin Salman was kind of sidelined for some time, and a wedge was driven between US and Saudi relations. Do you think in any way this is actually designed to drive a wedge between India and the Western world and the Western countries, specifically the US, the UK, and obviously the Quad in general? Do you think, and is there a Chinese hand in it? Or are we reading too much into it?
So I don't obviously I don't know what the motivations are, but it's always a question of, who benefits and who loses. I mean, it does not take any deep level of analysis to see what this does to the perception of India, which, and again, remember, in the context of China, comprehensive national power, you knock somebody else down, that even if you stay at the same level, if you've knocked somebody else down, you're ahead of that other one, right? So that's all quite clear. I mean, what's interesting is the UK hasn't stopped negotiations on a free trade agreement with India.
Yeah, they said it doesn't matter. That is the latest. It said that their relations will not be affected because of this allegation by Mr. Trudeau. Yeah, please tell me. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but what it'll do, and this is why nobody can be complacent about this, is there are seeded elements within all of these other countries that are pro-Chinese and possibly pro-Khalistani, who now have something else they can hold on to advance this. So they may not be in positions of power at the moment, but it may start to affect India's ability on the ground. I mean, in DC, people who absolutely wouldn't expect it, who are very aware of Chinese political warfare operations, already will bring up, India's persecution of the Christians. And then I'll go, well, can you give me some examples?
Exactly.
like instead of generalities, let's talk about specific cases. And there may be specific cases, but do you know about those cases because the people who did it are on trial? Because if they're on trial, then that means that the system is taking care of that situation, right? But that's already being seeded. That's already being, put in place into people's heads. So if you're already somebody that's fallen in to that kind of propaganda, and then this comes along, it makes you feel better about it reinforces you, and it makes you feel like, oh, see, I wasn't an idiot for saying that India's bad on the Christians, because look at what they just did in Canada. So it provides a confirmation bias piece of information or tool. It's not information. So I wouldn't be complacent about this. Getting back to just the real basics. Yeah, I'd like to see, if Canada has enough information to accuse India of it, if they do, and which that means that they know who pulled the trigger, right? I'd like to see somebody arrested, or somebody named, or case start.
Exactly.
And let's see the judicial process handle this. We've jumped straight to the geopolitical without an actual legal case happening. And if you know enough to say we're going to expel this Indian diplomat, then you have a lot of information about the case. So start a trial. And I think what we're more likely to see is a lot of terrorists killing each other as they fight for power within their criminal terrorist organization
network.
Yeah. And then what's going to happen? Then is Canada going to blame each of those killings on India?
Exactly.
So it's just, I would like to see a path, because because, we all want to think that everybody's being transparent and honest, that leads to prosecutions. If that starts to happen, and they're real cases, not the sort of cases where you bring in a police officer who wasn't there and doesn't speak the language and doesn't have notes, then that's a different conversation, right? What we have now is primarily political, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable, because the groups that benefit from this, the groups in the countries that benefit from this political act, are not good, and giving them oxygen and cover without proof for the situation that you're claiming justifies it. It makes me very uncomfortable, and I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. That's it.
Yeah, thank you, Cleo. But here, before we conclude, I want to make a point. As an Indian, I would like to know what exactly is Mr. Trudeau doing about people who are carrying out referendums in his country saying India should break up. Fine, okay, freedom of speech, that's fine. But how is it freedom of speech when these people take out floats where they are seen to be killing Indian leaders, where they take out posters saying that we are going to kill India, we are going to break up India, we are going to kill, they are naming particular diplomats and saying that these are our targets. Today, there is a video saying Hindu Indians go back to India. So basically, what Mr. Trudeau has done with this kind of rhetoric, irresponsible rhetoric, he is being hugely criticized in India for that. What he has done, he has opened up a huge segment of the Canadian population, the Indian Hindus, to the possibilities of attacks from these radical people. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, and it would seem consistent to me. The tools that you always try to use this somebody's own logic to figure out whether there's any consistency to it, right? And during the truckers' protest, in order to affect the behavior of peaceful protesters, they froze bank accounts of their family members, right? So if you're carrying around, and these were people who were not doing anything illegal. They had that, which is probably why they had to invoke the Emergency Act. I mean, don't forget, Canada invoked the Emergency Act not that long ago. And so that they could then do all the things that they wanted to do, even though the protests were very likely legal. I mean, there was a judge in Ottawa anyway, the point is that they froze bank accounts. And so they, by their own logic, they have said that is a justifiable tool to use against people who are doing things that the state doesn't think is conducive to civil society, to civil cohesion. So why aren't they seizing the bank account or freezing the bank accounts of people who are advocating for, as you're saying, terrorist-like activity, quite overtly, holding up posters, that encourage the sort of violence that you're talking about? There's been no crackdown. I mean, we still haven't prosecuted the funders of the Air India bombing.
Exactly.
So why aren't we starting with just cleaning up these cases that are an open wound on Canadian society? This is just not, and how can you justify freezing the bank accounts of the families of truckers who are peacefully protesting and not doing it for people who are who are advocating for, very, very deliberately close to the line of violence against diplomats, but also by extension, as you're saying, against other Canadian citizens who disagree with them, on a foreign policy issue. And I'm also from Quebec, and we've been getting a lot of policies around language laws and things like that have been increasingly restrictive of minority rights, English language minority rights. That also hasn't been stood up to by this government. So I don't, I wish that there was more coverage about what is going on in Canada by the international media. Objective, fair, transparent reporting about things like what's going on with the trucker case in Ottawa now. But nobody's reporting it. And because nobody's reporting it, in part, the government has control over narrative, which, regardless of whatever government it is not healthy in a democracy.
Yeah.
So, yes, while India is looking at this case, there's a lot of other things going on in Canada that have fed into this being possible. And if Canada is not going to do the sort of coverage about Canada itself that it needs to in order to have a healthy civil society, then it would be great if other journalists from other countries could help out. It's going to affect them anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we have to conclude the program now. The one last thing I'm going to say, to me, it seems like Mr. Trudeau has overestimated his own power to convince others to turn against India, specifically against Mr. Modi. And I think he has underestimated India and Mr. Modi's ability to turn this around and, to ensure that he does not get to Mr. Trudeau does not get to drive a wedge between India and the other countries, the Western countries. He doesn't get to, basically paint India into a corner. That is what I think he's trying to do. I don't think it's going to work that way. And, that is why I had asked the question about, is he kind of acting as a henchman of China? Sorry, Cleo, for using the word like that for your prime minister, but all of us Indians are incensed about it. We are furious. And trust me, it is all about cutting across party lines, by the way. It is not partisan. Everyone is furious with Mr. Trudeau. Let us hope India-Canada relations survive this. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being a good friend. As for viewers, until the next time, thank you.